Okay, welcome everybody. This is a truly fascinating, one-of-a-kind novel, and it is my pleasure to introduce our two authors. I'm going to give you their quick bios, and then they're going to talk to you about the evolution of the book itself. Rhonda Rosenberg has been collaborating with her husband on writing and book projects almost since they met at a book here in Houston at the JCC in 1991. She was working on her dissertation on public health as a civil religion and discovered the secret to how she would write it from the book he was on tour with at the time. Before that, she completed her undergraduate degree at Rice University, a graduate degree in economics from University of Houston, and taught economics in a college much like this campus, and earned her PhD in the Interpretive and Policy Sciences from the University of Texas School of Public Health in the UT Houston Health Science Center with a postdoctoral fellowship at Cal Berkeley. She has been an NIH-funded HIV prevention scientist and faculty member at FIU's Stempa School of Public Health for 20 years at the AIDS prevention program, where she does a lot of research, a lot of writing, and a lot of learning from the experts across our diverse communities in Miami, as well as its diverse non-human populations. Now, in a decade's worth of thinking about natural ecosystems like the Everglades and how it relates to the ancient history of the Bible, she has turned her thinking to the art of the novel, as the Eden Revelation expresses. David Rosenberg, when David collaborated with Herald Bloom on the Book of J in the early 90s, it stayed in the top 10 of the New York Times bestseller list for 7 weeks and was translated into several languages. 9 of David Rosenberg's books and anthologies, to which he commissioned and edited over 70 prominent creative writers, received full-page reviews in the New York Times and Book Review. As editor, Senior Editor Harcourt, Editor-in-Chief of the Jewish Publication Society, he worked with writers as diverse as Isaac Bashevis Singer and Mary Gaitskell. Rosenberg is the author of many volumes of poetry, including The Lost Book of Paradise and Dreams of Being Alive, based upon his biblical scholarship. He has a Guggenheim Fellowship for Nonfiction, a Penn Prize for Howitt's Bible, a Hopwood Special Award in Poetry, and a Canada Council Writers Grant, among other distinctions. His poems and essays have appeared in Harper's, The New Republic, Fortnightly Review, and Paris Review. And he has taught creative writing at several universities, most recently at Princeton. On the advice of poet W.S. Merwin and biologist Edward O. Wilson, Rosenberg was appointed poet in residence at Fairchild Tropical Botanical Garden, where he studied ecosystem evolution with visiting biologists from around the world. He was married at Fairchild to Dr. Rhonda Rosenberg, with whom he had founded Fieldbridge think tank, bringing together scientists and creative writers to study Florida Everglades. And I just wanted to read to you one of the pre-publication comments from authors who sort of previewed the book. This is from Grace Schulman. The sweepingly vast and courageous new novel tells of a lost archaeologist in ways that radiate out into the great losses of our time. 10 years in the making, The Eden Revelation is a book of epic dimensions, brimming with ideas as it deepens with characters and action. From David and Rhonda Rosenberg, a writer and a research scientist, respectively, in their being of the Florida Everglades. So let's start by having David and Rhonda talk about this very unusual collaboration between a poet, writer, and scientist, a husband and a wife. How difficult that would be for most people. And that their concept of this book, which is has a very deep Miami, South Florida connection or origin to it, as they have spent a lot of time in and thinking about the Everglades and our own Fairchild. So I want to have them sort of give you a little bit of how they came up with the idea and developed it together.
So, thank you, Linda. And I think we'll begin to give you just a short idea of a novel by reading an early review that describes our main character. So this novel has perhaps more to reveal about what we have never properly internalized. That for all our intelligence and creativity, we were not responsible for our evolving. Something as complex as the human brain, but much larger, had more to do with it. A natural ecosystem, large and complex enough that we were lost in it until we found our niche. So the authors of this evolutionary novel are to be commended for rooting their work in a time and place older than any prior fiction, the actual Garden of Eden. Everyone has heard of Adam and Eve, even if they never read the story in Genesis. There are even many people alive today walking around named Adam and even Eve. But what were the original humans in Eden actually like? And in terms of scientific evolution, what were the first Homo sapiens like? Those who evolved in a place that seemed like paradise to them because it had everything they needed: food, shelter, beauty, and room to explore. They also had sexual attraction, or else we wouldn't be here. And Rhonda will read the rest of it.
But more than the first humans, this novel has for its main character the lost natural ecosystem in which we evolved, somewhere in a vast area that scientists call the Syrian-African Rift, stretching through the Middle East down to Africa. This novel begins when an archaeologist, Archibald Schechner, accidentally digs up that fossilized, lost ecosystem, and it begins to tell him things that no one has heard in thousands of years. Of course, he's out of his head, traumatized by what he has found. All of his friends and colleagues try to get him psychiatric help. But at the same time, they're fascinated by what he's recounting of the ancient ecosystem's voice. What happens when these friends of Archie's collide with the various experts and literary scholars who arrive from Europe and America to interpret what he's saying leads to all kinds of mix-ups and earth-shattering insights, some of it scandalous, some of it revelatory. So begins this unique novel that bridges science and art, much like the late Harvard biologist Edward O. Wilson had in mind when he wrote, "The greatest enterprise of the mind has always been and always will be the attempted linkage of the sciences and humanities." That's where it stops.
We're going to start by answering a question that Linda suggested. She didn't actually ask it, but I knew it would come up somehow. And that is how we had to do this as a collaboration. Because literary novels are very rarely written by as a collaboration between other writers, and especially between a male and a female, and or if that's we want to use our pronouns. No, that's okay. So I'm going to start by saying a little about how we actually envision this as a novel, and then we'll go back and talk a bit about how we came to actually collaborate, and then we're going to read you about 15 minutes altogether from the novel to give you a taste of it, which is hopefully even more interesting than we are. Anyway, the novel takes its heart from what the contemporary Norwegian novelist Knausgaard called the duty of literature, which is to fight fiction. It's to find a way into the world as it is. Okay, so even though the category is fiction, if it's going to be a powerful novel today, it's going to fight through that to the world as it is. So usually that world means human society in novels. And but for us, it expanded into natural history way before humans came on the scene. And part of the novel is based on the Eden story in Genesis, which is, you know, a male and a female, Adam and Eve, who are pretty happy to be there in the garden until something goes wrong. So what is it? Our ancestors, our ancient ancestors, those who wrote the actual story in ancient Jerusalem of Adam and Eve, they understood that the subtlety of knowledge first comes in disguise. That is, in the story, it's when Satan disguised himself as a friendly serpent. So he was friendly, and Eve had no questions about it. So for ourselves, we too often fall victim to a kind of serpent that maybe you could describe it as a failure to ask why. Eve didn't ask to Satan, why should I eat the apple? It just looked good to her, that's what it said. And he persuaded her, if he was a he persuaded her to, that it would really taste great. And so as they fell victim to the serpent, because they didn't really ask why, you can see that the ancient writers of this story are hardly any different than anyone today, who is trying to get some knowledge of almost anything that isn't rote, like 2 + 2 = 4, because it's so hard for us, or anyone, to ask why when they're told something is a fact. It's a fact. So we just take it in, and asking why is really hard. And even when someone tries to give you an answer for why, you still have to ask more. You have to ask more. Okay, so let me give you one tiny story. So should I give her the? I'll give you this little story. You know, in Sigmund Freud's writing, he said that we all begin with the great intellectual failure by the age of 4. 3 or 4, maybe even 5. Our greatest intellectual endeavor is a question we have at that age, which is, where do babies come from? It's a kind of hidden question about, how did I get here? But also, they're no longer able to accept fantasy stories like you came with a stork or Santa Claus. They're asking, they're not literally asking it, they're thinking. They want to find out, where do babies come from? Because maybe they have a little baby sister. Anyway, the answer never arrives. This is our first great intellectual failure. All of us have internalized it and totally forgotten it. That we actually failed to discover our greatest first intellectual question. Where do babies come from? Because even if parents showed pictures of copulation to a 5-year-old, this would not really explain it. This would not really tell these kids that this is where I came from. It's too hard to understand at that age. So this issue of why it's so hard to ask why was what started us off in this book. You know?
Yes.
Where would you take it?
Well, I mean, I would take it with the why, where, you know, when I came on the scene, David had just been, as Linda was in the introduction noted, he had just been living 2 months in Fairchild Tropical Garden, writing a book on the grounds. That's when things were a lot looser then, and they allowed people, they had a place to live in the garden, and they often had scientists coming and living there. And you get to stay there overnight, and you know, it was terrific. And he realized that he hadn't asked a lot of why questions during his life. As he met the scientists who were part of the staff there, learned that there were male and female plants. And then I came on the scene, and I met these scientists, and we eventually took over the lease. We began to lease this house of the director of Fairchild Tropical Garden because he moved on to the National Tropical Botanical Garden. And we founded a think tank called Philbridge, in collaboration with this director, to bring scientists and writers together to do something that was just beginning for the very first time in this country. And that is the idea that you could restore an ecosystem. And the ecosystem they were going to focus on was, of course, the Everglades, which we discovered was like 30 minutes, at least at that time, with that light traffic to get to. And so we developed, we got funding for it. We brought together these scientists and literary writers, and we discovered something. They found it very difficult to leave their expertise behind and encounter an experience that they'd never encountered before. That is both collaborating and also for the writers, an ecosystem that has sawgrass you walk out into. It's something you can actually walk in. And the problem was that And this is something that I learned later when I was working in my job in public health, in HIV prevention. The problem is that if they're caught in having all the answers already, without the why question, then they have trouble communicating with the culture. The culture is full of why questions. They need guidance in how to ask, unless they can ask it on their own. And the expert needs to be able to communicate with them imaginatively. So we tried various ways and techniques to get this collaboration going. And ultimately, we decided that we were going to have to do it ourselves. And that's how the idea of collaborating on a book began. And it was only as we began to explore that it dawned on us that it was going to need to be a novel, not nonfiction purely.
Yeah,
And somehow,
at first we were thinking we would each write our own book, and it would be nonfiction. It would be a kind of autobiographical about how we experienced the Everglades as a wild wilderness that might be a model for something like the Garden of Eden. And but we not suddenly, it took a little while. You realize, and this is back in the 90s, but even then, more so today, of course, everyone is totally flooded with information from everything, from every kind of media, far more media now than there were even in the 90s. And after a while, just the fact that it's information can get a little boring. I mean, it's hard to keep paying attention all day to this information. And of course, in academia or wherever, you're still getting more and more information or interpretation of that information. And we realized that this is all going on in your head. This is all thinking. And we realized that the issue with understanding an ecosystem is actually feeling it, not thinking about it, but actually feeling what it's like to be in it. And of course, the two main people in our existence that felt that were the first two Homo sapiens in the Syrian-African rift, that place where our novel begins. So we began to think we needed a really, really unusual main character. We couldn't just have an ordinary person who has the usual problems of people, because that's what most novels are always about. And we started to think that what could this place be like, an ecosystem that was in some way a model for the Garden of Eden. And then we came up with the next major character, the archaeologist Archibald Schechner, because we had him digging in his usual way, and he accidentally came upon this ancient fossilized ecosystem from hundreds of thousands of years ago, which he was shocked to realize that everything about it resembled the Garden of Eden. So that's where our novel sort of began as an idea. Then we thought, well, how are we going to write this? We had to have more characters than Schechner, the archaeologist. And anyway, as Rhonda told you, he's pretty much traumatized by having discovered this. No one expected it could actually be discovered. And so we started to develop other characters who were related colleagues, friends of Schechner, and pretty soon they got him to a psychiatrist because they thought he really was nuts, that he thought he found the Garden of Eden and it was saying all these things to him. And so we got another character, the psychiatrist, but then we realized we've got too many, experts in this. We got to have more real people. And so we got the idea of the psychiatrist's daughter, who was her kind of, secretary for the office. We named her Julie, and we realized that Rhonda was probably better at thinking about what Julie thought about what was going on and the voice in Scheffner's head than anybody. And that's how our collaboration kind of began. And then more and more characters entered.
But then we found that as the collaboration went on, we were both writing on all of the characters. And to the point that in retrospect, because we imagined getting the question, well, who wrote what, in a collaboration, we realized we really couldn't answer that question anymore, because we were each writing on it all the time, and editing, and each had the kind of experience that might have gone into those
You
characters.
guys consult with each other. I have a science question, or I have a writing question. Not that you're not afraid of Rhonda. How tricky was that part of it?
Well, if you mean tricky in terms of our relationship, this was
It
easy.
helped that we were married.
But some might say that could be a problem. But no, I mean, one of our favorite routines is I came into this relationship developing a reputation very fast for asking lots of questions, and to the point where the question box would close at a certain point. So our favorite routines because of this is if we're thinking up something, I say, okay, but is that really true? And as my boss who's here tonight will attest, I have a tendency to check things every which way.
Yeah, in other words, I would have to say to Rhonda, don't forget, this is a novel. It doesn't have to be exactly true.
And
Your imagination.
yeah, and it really was a great experience, because when you are in academia, which is where I came from, at least in my education, you tend to, and this is what I was saying about the Philbridge project, you tend to want to nail things down, and the problem is that you really have to feel your way as well. And I just wanted, one thing that comes to mind on that is a very popular person right now in trying to educate the global population about the planetary stresses of our day, whether it's climate change or ecosystem loss, oceans, is the actress Jane Fonda. And so she's really, devoted herself to this. But the one thing that's missing, which maybe she'll discover soon, and that is the feeling part of it. It's more than the political action part of it. It's more than the facts. It's the feeling part of it, which as an actress and someone in the arts, that's the part that's really missing with most of the population, because the majority of the population it doesn't connect with.
So we've got to read a little from the book. And just on that note, as we said, the ecosystem that Archibald finds is an archaeological dig, is a model for the Garden of Eden, and became our main character. So this character of the ecosystem is throughout the entire book. It comes up in so many ways that all the characters interact with it. There are these literary experts and other kinds of reporters who come down from New York, or actually fly, this takes place in the Middle East, fly there, and they have all these questions about it, and they have problems with the answers because they're all so unusual. Everything the ecosystem says, but we're not going to actually read what the ecosystem says. It's in the book. It's a good quarter to a third of it. We're just going to read a little bit that gives you a flavor of how it goes. I'll start with the short section, and then Rhonda will take another section. So who would have thought that early man knew he evolved? Still, it's a fact that Neanderthals and early pre-humans of the Homo line lived together with Homo sapiens in certain times and places. I shouldn't have been surprised that the natural world described in the ancient scroll, the snatches of it I saw before it disappeared with Schechner, and the fragments of it in Julie's transcriptions, is the same one we lost when we became too civilized, a world of endless wonder. Even the word civilized makes it impossible to think of how our once newly evolved full frontal sexuality began. Scientists go on about brain sizes and tool making, but human genital size doubles other primates. The evolution of the genus Homo sprang from a sudden turning of the male to face the female in intercourse, as few apes ever had done. Face to face, seduction increased in subtlety and response, leading to a similar increase in the play of thought. We began to see ourselves in each other's eyes, and at that moment, we were a new species. That was a transcription from Schechner's tapes. Why is it crucial to know how, when, and where we evolved? Science trivial, I feel like answering the question, but I'm really reading the text. Science trivializes its own answers, explaining in bones and stones when the terms should be sense and sensibility, spirit and sexuality. How we evolved is not just a question of anatomy, but of the human spirit. How was it set in motion? It's too late now for the hubris that we ourselves evolved the human spirit in the cradle of our civilization. We know we're not even superior, spiritually speaking, to ancient men and women living in pristine ecosystems. They had the exact same genome that we do, and we only discovered this in, I'm editorializing, that's not in the book. But this book is actually set in the 1990s, when the first genome studies began. The secret of our sexual dependency remains in Africa. How pioneering our progenitors were, how much more daring and inventive compared to us. They walked into the unknown again and again. They were pilgrims and explorers in their own ecosystems, trailblazers into others. Their pioneering of intimacy, coupling off, allowed them to spread further and further abroad. Meanwhile, the bone men go on about brain size as if elephants and whales might be our intellectual superiors. No, no, the secret of evolution is in the nature of intimacy, forged in forest innocence. Sex is a species-specific act, the only one that will not become interspecies. Species may kill, eat, and play with other species, but they rarely cross boundaries to participate in the secret act that ensures evolving, sexual intimacy. And it is woman, according to Schechter, woman who is at the bottom of our inventiveness, her desire sharpening our thoughts, focusing our attention on the seductive unknown. The way the eye tracks a woman's curves, glued there by desire. That's a man speaking, of course. All things track, remembering what they need and where they have been. Even plants track the light and the elements and the animals they use in pollination. Even our sperm track to the womb. I realize that all my life has been a tracking back to there, to what it represents, eroticizing everything. That womb evolves into the form of a woman, and then a particular woman, and then for me, a Julie, someone crystallizing thoughts building up over a lifetime. Now, one more little paragraph to end then. Yet what remains to me is Julie's voice, and now I can connect it to that voice in the ecosystem she explained was what Archie was hearing, the voice from the ground, that hole in the ground Schechter found himself in. The voice holds me now the way her body once did, as I pumped to exhaustion. Both of us pedaling faster, she moaning like a rabbi lost in prayer, I in silence. You can't do it, she said to me after. You're like a machine. If I couldn't do it, I whispered, unable to shout, you wouldn't be drenched in sweat like you are. Like a man is what I mean. Like a human, not like some goddamn academic symposium of epistemology. Go ahead.
Okay.
So this is from a later part.
Svitz sighed as he spoke, and I allowed myself to soothe him, letting his hand rest in mine as he continued. The human being hides a sting like a bee, and when its house is upset, it goes mad in defense. The Germans, in their madness, imagined themselves attacked. They blamed their weak mothers for the vulnerable state of the hive, and they went out to dominate the world like their fathers had done in philosophy. But outside their own hive were only shadows, not fellow human beings, and inside were larger shadows. The Jews, who must have loomed large as beekeepers to them. That's what they were, the Jews, beekeepers of civilization. You can see it now in the orchestras of Israel, in desert towns with their repertoires of Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart, and in tiny Tel Aviv apartments combed to the ceiling with books. Meanwhile, Julie had ordered a big salad, and I was staring into it as she nibbled. It looked like a work of art set on a vast plate instead of in a bowl. The small cucumber slices fixed in a green necklace around the long-necked Israeli tomatoes. More like a jewelry tray than a salad. If anything ensures humility, I remember thinking as Fitz and I wandered down a street off the square and came abruptly onto the beach and facing the sea. It's trying to reconstruct nature while we've got our binoculars backward. Then I was explaining to Spitz how I was discovering that a major ecosystem can seem as vast and diverse as the universe and even more distant. Its complexity, woven in millions of years of history, defies the complex organ we've developed to mimic it, namely our brains. But at the mention of ecosystems, Spitz coughed as if somebody was trying to choke him. "Spare me," he implored with a wave of his hand, so the conversation would continue in my head. If you don't know your function in an ecosystem, you can't see yourself, and you can't trust nature. It's a license for madness, cruelty, repressive debates between science and religion. A license for art, Spitz would have said, for character, drama, sexuality, all the best reasons for being alive. And a mask for cruelty, I would silently add, trying to slow him down in my mind. All things kill and feed as far as they can range, I continued, now out loud. I'm sure you agree with that, but only we invent an ethical purpose to hide our guilt. Julie had eaten halfway around the necklace. Guilt, he asked. Guilt for this pact with death, I answered. Even if it's imaginary, we make the deal when we sublimate the wish to kill and digest our competitor. It may be the crowning human achievement, this guilt, I continued, while Spitz listened to my outburst ruefully as if I was some foreign colleague from Ethiopia who must be tolerated. Who was I, after all, but a pent-up philologist? Nevertheless, I parade marched my force of words before the distracted general. As a complement to this guilt, the human imagination evolved. Our faces are masked as a result, an artifice, capable of showing untrue feelings. And the truth, all our complexity is covering up. Animals don't need a purpose because their niche in the ecosystem is plain. But we have buried ours somewhere back in the forest and savannas, and our cover-ups are so complex, so artful, that they produce great theories of science, systems of religion, and works of art. It's a cruel business and it inflates our sense of superiority, Spitz responded. But then, my boy, what else can we do with our advanced knowledge? Young mothers with burnished skins of Yemen passed us, pushing strollers occupied by toddlers with yellow mashed potato cheeks. I pushed on, subverting the question. The more we're superior to other living things, both those too small and those too distant in the universe to see, the more we lose sight of the limits of our intelligence. Between bites of the tomatoes she had cut with fork and knife, Julie pointed out features of the Jerusalem landscape below us, gesturing with knife in hand, her short arm accentuating the gleaming utensil. Spitz paced on, apparently not listening or looking at anything, not the golden tamarind trees whose leaves sat at their feet like 100 discarded earrings, not the ceremonious gray clouds streaked with sunlight above the Bauhaus-influenced Art Deco buildings, not the mixed pasta of small wrappers and cigarette butts that lined the margins of the esplanade, as if neatly swept there by a brisk wind. Why is it here and here alone that you can't admit ignorance? That's the issue I wanted to put before Spitz. And I had the answer for him. Because this beach and ocean is the actual field, not some artificial field of knowledge. If you face the beauty of the field, your own creations shrivel up. The truth behind Shakespeare or Freud is how touching we are, how small and vulnerable, and how all we know of what is moving and poignant is allied with infancy. What can we imagine more vulnerable and helplessly intense than a human infant? I thought this, but didn't say it. I said nothing more, and Spitz waved a weak farewell as I lingered and he retraced his steps quickly toward the taxi stand in the Dizengoff. I had no maternal instincts for Spitz, the suckling Julie was saying, brandishing the fork over her now empty plate. He couldn't feed on my energy. I teased him with ecology stuff he hated to hear because he didn't know how to refute it. Do you know why a swamp contains more records than the British Museum? Know why, he said with a frown, as if waiting for the punchline of a bad joke, I answered him. The diversity of species there is more complex than the origins of civilization. Imagine how smart I felt telling the famous critic of so-called originals where the real sources were. So Spitz is the literary critic, and I think you might have gathered this was taking place in Israel, in Tel Aviv, and you can see Jerusalem there on a clear day.
So
So Linda may have some questions.
anybody can have a question.
Yeah, I mean, doesn't Rhonda have a beautiful reading voice? He's just like the nun. I love that part about the mask. I mean, this novel really, it makes you think very deeply. It's just so many ideas popping up, and just makes you think about so many different things. So they just touched on a few. Does anybody have any questions, either about the content or the process?
Yeah.
I'm just curious how you organize like such great volumes of information, how you will, start to conceptualize it. Like, do you have storyboards all over your walls? How do you start organizing a story to move it into the book?
Right, that's a good question. So we, for the longest time, almost a year, we didn't really know that this was going to be a novel. We weren't sure. We were just organizing our thoughts. And when we started writing, we wrote in different places. For a few years, we lived in Pinecrest, and Rhonda would go down Red Road, drive down Red Road to a great cafe that they've bulldozed away many years ago. What was it called?
I don't know.
I remember. But
it was on Sunset and Ludlam on the other side.
So she would write there. I would drive into the part of what was that park called? That was next to Fairchild.
Well,
Campon?
no, it was.
Yes. So I would drive into Matheson Hammock, find a place that was uninhabited, and right there in a van that I bought and specially outfitted for a writer. This was the 90s, so we didn't have internet yet. Oh, yeah? Maybe
No, we didn't.
So,
No.
I mean, but I had a
Not
laptop.
out there.
I had a laptop and a something to copy it onto a disk, and I had a thermos of coffee and all kinds of stuff, and a little refrigerator where I'd keep a sandwich in, and I could work there for a few hours. Then I would come back to Sunset and pick up Rhonda at the cafe.
Yeah,
and
it's,
we
it's
would,
actually where an ice cream parlor is now. I think it's not quite at Sunset.
So we would go home, and as we were driving home, we would be talking about what we did and how it was so different. I mean, what she wrote and what I wrote. I mean, how are we going to get this together? And so it was only after we did quite a bit of this that we got to that question I started with, and that is, what's our main character? What's called a protagonist? And that's when we started to think we could not have some kind of unique human being. There's just too much of that. It had to be something totally experimental. But of course, great experimental novelists were writing in the 90s. Writers like Toni Morrison, Isaac Bashevis Singer, they both Nobel Prize winners, Americans, they were still writing in the 90s. But they were still using ordinary people as their characters, and they had really unusual ways to delve into memories, but it still never totally reached out into the world as it is, natural. We live in a natural world, even though you could live in Miami and never know that.
Well, I'll just say that I periodically, since we entered the app universe of the internet and stuff, because I write, I'm a research scientist, and I write and collaborate, and I'm always periodically, before we start another project, I do a lot of research, see what's new in the apps. You know, there are a lot of storyboard or things that can be adapted to storyboard. I look at things like the latest thing for a lot of writers to get past that barrier to actually writing is the free write, which you may have heard of. In the end, though, you basically, or at least I find, that you just haul off and write on anything, you know, whatever. Microsoft Word, it doesn't, you know, a diary app, it really doesn't matter as long as it's not going to lose your stuff. But this book, this was the 90s, and I, at that time, did not have something like this, which a few years ago I even got an external keyboard for, you know. It was light. I wrote in a notebook that wasn't even as fancy as this, you know, a larger size version of this. And he was writing on, he had the laptop. I didn't yet have a laptop, I had a desktop. And Delhi Lane was another place I would write at. And so all this stuff had to be typed up into, software at a certain point. In terms of organizing the information, I'm thinking back at that thing that you said as we got started, which is the Norwegian writer Knausgaard, who can go on and write about his personal dramas, you know, with both in childhood, 5 volumes worth, but also there are these kind of essays embedded in it of any topic, art, poetry, literature. He came much later, but what I'm thinking is that he wrote this from his mind as it had digested. He may have looked things up as you do later, but we really wrote this from whatever we had digested, whatever we read, New York Times, which used to have a fantastic Science Tuesday.
Which is lost like everything else.
Yeah, Scientific American, you know, anything we'd find in Borders bookstore or other bookstores, which was a great bookstore here at one time. And something we'd see would lead to an association. And then we'd do something off of it. And it, there might be a fragment here and there that was in our experience, our own personal experience, but we would do a rift on it. So that experience is not really in here. It's kind of the way I imagine Knausgaard writing when I've watched him being interviewed in the last few years when he talks about it. He had a big thing about it being, it's autobiographical, but it's a novel. Is it autobiographical? And so to him, it was really coming out of his mind, and memory comes through the mind. It's not a documentary somewhere.
So just one quick answer to what you actually asked. How did we organize this? Because Rhonda's describing that, and this is right, to write it, it had to be all over the place. We had to be as free as possible. We didn't worry about a deadline. We didn't have a contract for this book. And we just thought we can see what happens. And it wasn't until years later that we went back to it. We had all this stuff. But many years later, we went back to it, looked at it again, and then we started a new draft and went through several drafts of, what you say, organizing. It wasn't actually organizing, it was sort of feeling our way through it, how to get from what one character says to another without causing any dissonance, cognitive dissonance. And you might have heard that. It was an extreme example of that in what Rhonda read from the novel, because she was reading what a male character, the philologist, was writing and saying, and then she segued into what Julie, the female character, was saying or thinking, and these were two different scenes that had been established earlier. So you didn't know that, but nevertheless, we wanted the writing to always feel like that. Like you never knew exactly what was gonna happen next.
And I think it's like that because our purpose in doing this was not to, we're not a Carl Zimmer, and if you know anything about science literary writing, he's a leading science literary writer, beautiful writer, but he takes you on a trip somewhere to discover facts and to discover experts in those facts. And we did not want to go in that direction because the thing that's still missing is the feeling part of it. That's why there's a missing emotionality in this. And so the character of Julie is both kind of personifies the destabilizing aspect and the anchoring aspect. Goes back and forth within herself and encompasses the major destabilizing force of this archaeologist scientist who descends upon them, hearing voices of an ancient ecosystem.
Anyone else have any
Yeah.
quick questions?
Forgive me for the personal nature of this next question, which is actually about a question about your marriage and the relationship between the two and your marriage. I have engaging writers. I find myself often asking them about what gets them through their work from beginning to end, and quite often in that conversation, a certain conclusion emerges, and that conclusion is that when they began their work, the initial concept, they felt they had something to say, and then on that journey to the final organization of ideas and presentation, that they found that something different happened along the way. And I can't help thinking about this work in a way that, and please just respond in any way you want. It's not really a direct question. Number one, does this work in a way? Does it represent a metaphor for your own marriage and how it came together and how it this process that came to a conclusion? And did it change your relationship? Anything?
You want to answer that?
No, I'll let me answer
Okay.
first. It's only two words, yes and yes to both questions. Of course it changed it. As for our marriage, of course it did. It's got us to thinking about things in the nature of intimacy, as you discussed here, that we probably never would have. And probably most people don't think about that deeply, even though you can feel it. Usually you feel intimacy when there's conflict. You know, if you have an argument, you realize how intimately you're involved or don't want to be involved, right? So I should just say one thing, that I from listening to Rhonda and me read this from the novel, it doesn't give you a holistic sense of the depth of emotion we really were dealing with. Part of it was real despair about the human species. I think we sound a little cavalier about the human species in here, but we couldn't hide from the fact that we were discovering more and more that there's something wrong with the human species. There's something wrong with civilization that we'd already learned
That's a good point.
we'd already learned in university from, you know, Freud's Civilization and its Discontents, that there's something wrong with civilization.
That's the way we got so immersed in the move to Miami. It was great and everything, his stay at Fairchild when he was a writer in residence. But what you found out was that these scientists were in despair, because the scientists that were in residence here and the ones coming through to give talks and so forth, they were going back and forth to ecosystems that were rapidly disappearing.
Such as in Madagascar.
Yeah, and they were feeling quite compelled by David because they saw a way that they would be able to articulate this loss. And he actually conducted some writing workshops for them. And so when I was introduced to all of this, this is what really got to me, because I was compelled with how in the world you would, both in science and in art, capture a feeling of loss. And I had recently discovered my own Jewish antecedents and the loss thereof. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been rediscovered. And in that, you discover a whole literature of and depth of thought and interpretation of loss. And this all came together, for me at least, in being able to find a different way, a new way of talking about science, talking about the loss in doing science with ecosystems. Evolution is about that, because there have been many years, an understatement, since Darwin. You might say he had more of a splash when his book came out in the 1800s than anything has since. And what is this about? It's about origins. It's about origins, and you go to a Shakespeare play. There was a great Shakespeare troupe here in the 90s. It's about origins. Every Shakespeare play is about how did it happen? Where did this tragedy or comedy come from? How did we get here? You know, and why is death descending upon us? And so it's the loss that really galvanized this book. And to have any intimacy that grows and stands the test of time, you have to be able to integrate loss. If nothing else, the passage of time.
So we could just end it there by saying what Rhonda was referring to in terms of Jewish literature. It was the Bible, of course. The ancient Jews who wrote the Bible and their feelings, even with the story of the Garden of Eden, that it was a great loss. A great loss to lose the Garden of Eden, not just because it was paradise, but because we didn't have to struggle or fight to live freely there with a free mind.
And what we dramatize, I think, here is we have a lost ecosystem in our ancient history.
In Miami.
No, Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
We have a lost ecosystem in our ancient history that we just don't think about. And we have a creativity that led us into it and out of it, which was evolution that we don't think about, a desire to evolve. And we kind of developed that as a way to both get the characters and to dramatize evolution, I think, in a way you just don't see it anywhere.
So this is, I mean, you've got to read, this is just in this brief conversation, you can see the brilliance of their minds and these ideas and how they found a plot to put a narrative on it and dramatize it, as Rhonda said. So you've got to read it. You know, it's about our origins. It's about where we're going. It's about what we've lost, and it's kind of what we're losing right here as we speak. So you can purchase the book in the room across the hallway, and if you want to talk some more with David, Rhonda, feel free. Okay, thanks for coming.